Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and the NBA playoffs have been amazing so far. We've had some wild individual performances, some unbelievable upsets, and we don't really know at this point who's going to win the title, which has been a theme all season, but it feels like now more than ever the league is absolutely wide open. It starts with the championship favorite Milwaukee Bucks falling in the first round to the Miami Heat. Over in the East as well, you have Boston, who just had a really tough series against Atlanta, but they've got to go through Philly, who looked amazing against the Nets, but they're also dealing with some injury issues. Over in the West, with the Phoenix Suns, they have to go through the Denver Nuggets and vice versa. The Golden State Warriors are still battling the Sacramento Kings right now in the first round too. We don't know who's going to end up winning a title, and even there are some teams outside of those squads that may have a chance. However, in today's video, the team that I actually want to focus on is a squad that is no longer in championship contention, but it's one that I personally thought would not only be in contention still at this point in the season, but I thought they would end up winning the entire thing before the year, and that squad is the Los Angeles Clippers. Coming into the year, LA was tied for the fourth best championship odds, and I actually, like I said, picked them to win it all, and there are a number of reasons for exactly why I thought they would ultimately break the Clippers' curse. It started off with Kawhi Leonard, who missed the entirety of last season due to an ACL injury, and I did expect him to have some rehab time throughout the season, take some load management days as he always does, but I felt like, having a full season off, maybe this would finally be his opportunity to stay healthy for an entire year, and when he's healthy, he's been a borderline top 5 player for the past few seasons, and when you get to the playoffs, there's very few people, if any, that you want over Kawhi Leonard in those moments. Also, he had Paul George alongside him, who had a phenomenal season last year before injuries kind of derailed it, and the Clippers ended up missing the playoffs. Them two, when healthy, are one of the best duos in the league, and they were surrounded by a great supporting cast. At least in theory. On paper, the supporting cast looked stacked. They had a bunch of names that theoretically complemented their two stars well, and overall just filled the roster with a lot of depth. Some of these names included Marcus Morris, Zubats, Nick Batum, Terrence Mann, Norman Powell, Robert Covington, Luke Kennard, Reggie Jackson, John Wall. On paper, this is beginning of the season, this seemed like a phenomenal roster surrounding Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, and you also had them being led by Tyronn Lue, who last season was considered by many to be one of the best coaches in the league. He was a Coach of the Year candidate because despite Kawhi Leonard missing the entire year and Paul George missing a majority of the season, the Clippers came this close to actually making the playoffs despite all those problems. So you had the return of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George hopefully at full strength. You had a Clippers roster that last year almost managed to make the playoffs without their two stars, and Tyronn Lue, who led that group nearly to a playoff berth. It seemed like the perfect recipe for a team that could go ahead and compete for a championship, and with the league more wide open than ever, as I've said in the past, it felt like that this could have been the Clippers' opportunity. So I picked them to win the title. I thought they would go ahead and do so, but as I sit here and record this video, not only did the Clippers not win the finals, they didn't make it, they didn't make a conference finals, they didn't make a second round, they only won one game in their first round matchup en route to their early exit. This is just another disappointing season in what has been a series of many since Kawhi and Paul George came to town back in 2019. Now, every season that they've been eliminated, the Clippers have had some kind of thing to point to as the reasoning behind why they didn't end up meeting their ultimate goal. Back in 2020, when they blew that 3-1 lead to the Nuggets in the bubble, there were a couple things that they pointed to. Number one, the bubble is just kind of a weird situation, but also number two, a lot of people pointed at Doc Rivers. Being the coach, he had blown multiple 3-1 leads in the past, and usually the head coach is the first one to be the scapegoat of a new team that doesn't meet expectations. So Doc Rivers was axed, and they brought in Tyronn Lue, hoping to retool the roster a bit, have a new head coach, and have things be better in 2021. And honestly, they might have been. I mean, they were looking really good throughout the first couple rounds of the playoffs, but then Kawhi Leonard ultimately tore his ACL against the Utah Jazz in the second round, which basically immediately dashed any championship hopes. Now, Paul George and the rest of the guys did a great job. They finished off that second round series and pushed the Phoenix Suns to 6 games in the Western Conference Finals, but without Kawhi Leonard, they couldn't end up getting it done, and so they fell short. Now, if Kawhi Leonard didn't get hurt, maybe that was the season for the Los Angeles Clippers. Maybe that was their big opportunity, but ultimately, we will never know. And so heading into 2022, Kawhi Leonard out again that entire season with that ACL injury. Like I mentioned, Paul George had a good year, but ended up missing a bunch of it due to injuries himself, and they ended up falling in the play into the New Orleans Pelicans. So first year, Doc Rivers was the person a lot of people pointed to. The past 2 seasons, it's been injuries, and coming into 2023, injuries were once again looming, as it always does with this team, but a lot of people had their fingers crossed, hoping that they could somehow stay healthy this season. Now, Kawhi and PG both missed some time throughout the year due to load management, but for the most part, they stayed relatively healthy. However, right at the end of the season, about a week and a half before the playoffs began, Paul George ended up getting tangled up with Lou Dort on a rebound, and his knee went the way your knee is not supposed to go. And with this hyperextension, I forget exactly what they called it, Paul George was ruled out for a few weeks, including the start of the playoffs, and eventually it would be revealed that this was going to keep him out of the entirety of the first round, which seemed like a death sentence because the Clippers ended up having to go against the Phoenix Suns, who were many people's pick to come out of the Western Conference. So immediately things looked really grim for the Clippers, but in game one they were able to beat the Suns in Phoenix, led mostly due to Kawhi Leonard, who continued to look like one of the best playoff performers on the planet. He was absolutely unstoppable, both offensively and defensively, and all of a sudden it looked like, hey, the Suns might be kind of vulnerable. You have Kawhi Leonard, you still have a solid supporting cast, Russell Westbrook, who they added right around the trade deadline. Maybe they could go ahead and get this thing done, or at least extend the series so maybe Paul George can make an unexpected comeback later on in the matchup. However, following game two, it was revealed that Kawhi Leonard had sprained his knee, an injury that would keep him out for the rest of the matchup, and even further beyond if the Clippers pulled off some miraculous win over the Suns in this first round. And ultimately, they wouldn't win a game after Kawhi Leonard went down. Now, they made basically all of them close. Russell Westbrook was amazing. The supporting cast stepped up. And it was a good showing from a team that originally at the beginning of the season seemed incredibly deep. This is what I expected from the supporting cast all season. But it was just too little too late. Paul George and Kawhi Leonard not playing was a death sentence, and the Clippers end up falling out of this round of the playoffs in 5 games, winning just one in a season where many people picked to win the NBA Finals. And so for the third season in a row, the Clippers can point to injuries as the ultimate factor for why they didn't end up meeting their goals. And maybe even if they were fully healthy all these seasons, they still don't win a title. But it's a big what if. It's a big question mark for this Clippers franchise, and Clippers fans, I'm sure, thinking what could have been if we could have just stayed healthy. And sure, going into next year, we can once again hope, okay, maybe we'll finally get to see a fully healthy Clippers run. But it's reached a point where I'm not really ever sure we're going to see that with Kawhi and PG as their lead stars. It just feels like it's really unlikely. In his post-game press conference after the Clippers got eliminated, Tyronn Lue noted that the Clippers, with him as the head coach, are undefeated in series where Kawhi and Paul George are both fully healthy. And yeah, that's true, but they've only had 4 playoff series under him. They're 2-2 in those series, so it's not exactly a big sample size. So while theoretically, you think that if Kawhi and Paul George have been healthy all these years, maybe they at least make an NBA Finals, if not win one, we'll never really know. And with these injuries, with a lot of flaws showcased on the roster over the course of this season, including a really aging core with multiple key contributors getting older and older, Paul George and Kawhi Leonard themselves continuing to go into their 30s. There's also questions around Tyronn Lue as the head coach. Is he going to be back? Should he be back? Is he the right answer? People are starting to debate on Twitter if this should be the end of this Clippers era as we know it. Should they just go ahead and say, okay, we tried, the injuries were too much, it didn't work, the roster's old, we're kind of out of assets to upgrade in meaningful ways. Maybe we just go ahead and pull the plug on this thing, admitting that ultimately it didn't work out. Also, some people on the other side of the debate that are saying, you still have Kawhi Leonard, you still have Paul George, Tyronn Lue's still a good coach. You can't give up on this. You have to go for it. Try and rebuild this roster a little bit. All you need is one healthy season, and maybe you can go ahead and get it done. So in today's video, I want to talk about both of these paths, whether they decide to compete, whether they decide to rebuild, and honestly go over why I think both of them have major flaws and why the Clippers are kind of stuck at this point. Let's first talk about the path of competing, where the Clippers decide a rebuild just isn't an option at this point. We have Kawhi Leonard, we have Paul George, we believe in this team even if others don't. We're going to go ahead and run this thing back, which I think makes a lot of sense. Again, I don't know if they're ever going to be healthy, but I'm sure the Clippers are thinking to themselves, if we can just stay healthy for a full season, maybe we can get this thing done. And getting 2 players of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George's caliber on your roster is incredibly rare. If the Clippers go into a rebuild, there's no guarantee they will see 2 talented guys like this anytime soon. So I completely understand if they decide to go ahead and compete. But it's not as easy as just hoping for good health. They have a lot of significant problems on this roster that need addressing around Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. However, the problem is that they don't have many assets to make upgrades at all, because Back in the Paul George trade, they gave up all their draft picks. They gave up Gilgeous-Alexander, their best young asset, and now they don't have a first-round pick to trade until 2028 or 2029, and they can only trade one of those picks due to the Stepien rule, which makes it so that you can't trade back-to-back years of picks. Now, they can do a pick swap with one of those, but those are their only two picks for the next, 6-7 years at this point. They don't have exactly assets, so upgrading the roster is going to be really difficult. And in terms of guys on the roster that they can trade as assets themselves, they don't have many. They have two young guys who are kind of interesting. Terrence Mann in particular is probably the most intriguing young piece on this team. He's shown a lot of promise when they gave him the starting spot for part of this season, and I think he could really thrive in a bigger role. Meanwhile, they also have Bones Highland, who's also an interesting young piece, but the Nuggets just traded him for basically nothing at the deadline, so I don't think he exactly has a ton of value. And outside of those two guys, the rest of their roster for the most part is aging veterans who are making a lot of money and probably don't have a ton of trade value. This list of guys includes Nick Batum, Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, Mason Plumlee, and Eric Gordon. They have very little pick equity. Most of their players are aging veterans on big contracts, and the two young guys that they do have don't really feel like the centerpieces of massive blockbuster deals. It's not a lot of assets to upgrade this roster. Now, the roster isn't terrible by any means. I still think it's pretty good. They've got some solid guys, but the problem is most of their players who are contributors at this point, like I've mentioned, are getting older. I mean, you talk about Marcus Morris, who I thought coming into the season was going to be a big part of what this team did. He was really bad, and he got benched for part of the season. Now, Tyronn Lue continued to try and start him for some reason, but he was just bad over the course of this season. Nick Batum kind of regressed. He wasn't great in the playoffs. Eric Gordon looked good, but he's getting older. Same with Norman Powell. Ultimately, it's just an aging roster. Russell Westbrook, who was a key contributor at the end of the season and was one of the biggest reasons why they stayed alive in the playoffs, he's a free agent. So even if they manage to bring him back, he's also getting older continuously. So everybody on this roster is getting older. They're all on the wrong side of 30. In fact, they're the second oldest roster in the league, only behind Milwaukee, who also just had an early exit. This isn't exactly ideal for the Clippers, and it's also concerning when you think about the aging veterans that you have on your roster. Many of them could become even more injury prone, which has already been the biggest bane of your existence in this Clippers era. Once again, I don't think this is a terrible roster. I still think the Clippers are a pretty good team overall, but it feels like they definitely need to get a bit better, especially when you look at their stats, because they were the 17th ranked offense and the 17th ranked defense in this season. They were also wildly inconsistent. It really just never felt like the Clippers hit their stride. Although part of this might have been because Kawhi Leonard and Paul George did both load manage throughout the season and missed some time with some various other things. Meanwhile, while we're on the topic of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, something else that's really terrifying about trying to continue to compete is that both of these guys have a player option after next season, which I would be stunned if they decline. This will be both of their last chances, or at least one of their last chances, to secure a big long-term contract. So I expect both of them to opt out, and that means your two biggest stars are going to be free agents after next season. If you're disappointing once again, the roster feels like it's aging and it really feels like there's no legitimate championship window, I wouldn't be shocked at all if one or both of those guys walked. And if you lose both of them for nothing after giving up the biggest trade asset haul in NBA history to bring these two in, it's just going to be a complete disaster. Ultimately, I think if the Clippers make some smart moves, get a bit younger, bring in more reliable pieces on both sides of the ball, and get a fully healthy season, especially in the playoffs, out of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, they can still win a title. I don't think their championship window is completely closed, but it's definitely closing pretty rapidly. And all those things that I mentioned, it's hard to do all of that in one season. And even if you do make the smart trades, you make this roster better, and it looks like the best team the Clippers have maybe ever had, there's still absolutely no guarantee that Paul George and Kawhi Leonard stay healthy, and in fact, at this point, I really just don't expect them to. So while I do think the championship window is still partially open, there are a lot of question marks surrounding this, and these question marks and the other issues I mentioned earlier on in this video have led a lot of people to decide that the Clippers need to go ahead and rebuild, that this era should end right here, right now. You should trade Kawhi Leonard, trade Paul George, any other assets you have on this team, and just straight out tank for the next couple years to try and rebuild this roster from the bottom up. The big problem with this is, as I mentioned earlier, they own none of their draft picks. Everything goes to Oklahoma City for the next few seasons. So even if next year you trade Kawhi, you trade Paul George, you get a ton of great young players, you get draft picks, it's looking good. Like, you have assets going forward. You don't have your own assets, which are by far the most valuable because those are the only ones you can control. You can trade for a team's next 6 first-round picks going forward and try a rebuild, but if that team's just good in the future, if you give them Kawhi and Paul George and they're just good for the next few seasons, those picks don't mean anything, especially if you don't have your own to allow yourself to build up the roster as you continue to go through this process. The Clippers could spend 5-6 years in this purgatory because they don't own any of their picks, while meanwhile, they would just be giving Oklahoma City more assets on top of the crazy amount of assets that they already have. And as a Thunder fan, I'm not opposed to this. I would love to see this outcome happen to us, just make the young core better, give us more top 5 picks. But ultimately, from the perspective of someone that if I'm trying to build the Clippers up, I just don't think it's the right move. I also have concerns that if the Clippers try and trade Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, they're not going to exactly get the packages that most people think that they will. Now, Kawhi and Paul George are both still highly valuable, amazing players, but with these injury issues surrounding them, how valuable are they actually? I think Kawhi Leonard could get you numerous first-round picks and also some really solid young assets. Paul George could probably also get you a few picks and maybe a young player or two, but there's also a potential that I'm a little bit overvaluing them as potential players because the injury concerns are very, very real. So there's a chance that you don't get as much value as you were hoping for these two players, meaning that once again, your rebuild is going to start with no assets of your own and way less than maybe you were expecting when you dealt your 2 stars. With this in mind, I think there's a -% chance that the Clippers blow this thing up this offseason. It just really doesn't make sense. I know theoretically, if you think their championship window is closed, that they should go ahead and start from the beginning, but it would just be a disaster. They would be stuck in the rebuild for such a long time, and I know it makes sense to theoretically start earlier so it gets done with sooner, but at this point, if you still technically have a championship window open, if you can just stay healthy and make some solid moves, I understand why the Clippers want to continue to try and compete. In fact, I fully expect them to just run this thing into the ground. They're going to try over and over and over again until one of either Kawhi Leonard or Paul George decide to leave, request a trade, or just retire as Clippers, going all the way till the end of their careers. I really think the Clippers are just going to keep trying this again and again because they know they have 2 high-level stars. They know that they committed literally everything to this era. They've got to give it a go, and this is why I don't think the rebuild path is really viable in this moment. One thing I've seen people talk about that I think is a bit more plausible than a full-out rebuild is a Paul George trade. Now, you may be saying, okay, well, why would they do that? And I think the logic behind it is you still have Kawhi Leonard, who's your superstar, your top guy, and maybe it makes more sense rather than giving him a secondary star to just surround him with high-level pieces. You trade Paul George, get a couple of assets back, some really solid guys on both sides of the ball, and maybe even some draft capital to upgrade the roster further, and boom, maybe your roster is a bit better overall. Now, not having that second star is a big question mark because if Kawhi Leonard goes down with an injury or he has to load manage, now you don't have a secondary star to raise your floor in his absence, which is a big concern with someone who's as injury prone as Kawhi Leonard. But it's a concept that is out there. Now, I don't think this happens either. I think there's a lot of problems with it, with lowering your floor, not having a secondary star, which is pretty important in today's NBA. Ultimately, I still don't think this makes sense, but I think it's just a bit more possible than a full-out rebuild, and maybe it's something we see if the Clippers again fail next season. In conclusion, either path that the Clippers take has a lot of question marks surrounding it. Whether they try to compete, continuing again and again to push for that championship, while ultimately coming up short, mainly in large part due to unfortunate injury luck, or they could admit defeat and start over, starting an incredibly lengthy rebuild that would begin with minimal assets and a really uncertain future ahead. Honestly, I don't think either path is incredibly promising, but at this point, at least going into next season, beyond that, we'll see. But I think for right now, competing and staying with this core of Kawhi and PG is the right way to go. You have 2 incredibly talented players. The supporting cast is all right. You can still make some upgrades even if the assets are limited. And ultimately, all it takes is a couple good moves and finally one fully healthy season for the Clippers to maybe once again be competing for that title. I mean, they looked really good when they were playing the Phoenix Suns without Paul George. If they had him, maybe they win that series. Maybe they win their second round series in a wide open Western Conference. Maybe they make the NBA Finals. However, this is once again a bunch of what ifs and what has been an era of what ifs for the Clippers, so maybe I'm once again falling for fool's gold, but I do think it's the right way to go forward. A rebuild just doesn't make sense at this point. Maybe by the 2024 trade deadline, the Clippers are kind of disappointing and there are rumors circulating that one or both of their stars could leave in the offseason. We can revisit this conversation and maybe at that point it's the right decision for the Clippers to go ahead and trade them rather than losing them for nothing, but for now I think ultimately the Clippers are going to try to compete again and it's probably the right move. With all that being said, I appreciate y'all watching. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of these videos. Last year, I did a video on basically every team that got eliminated from the playoffs, talking about what was next for them, what I could see being part of their offseason. And if you want to see more of that, let me know in the comment section below. Give me teams that you want to hear me talk about. But for right now, I appreciate y'all watching. I'll see y'all later. Real one, save back.